Hello, honeys, and welcome to today's episode. I realized shortly after publishing all of our social media stuff about it that perhaps glass wars is not the best term for what we're going to be discussing today. Maybe a better term is feuds, because we're talking about economic rivalries which paralleled political rivalries. The story of glass and its innovations is a story of competition, so we'll be focusing in today on the height of that competition, the 15th through the 19th centuries just about. A quick note about our sources before we begin. Today they include the Getty, the Corning Museum of Glass, and the Art Institute of Chicago, along with Bonham's Auction House and others. As always, the source document is available for your look over in the episode description. And now, honeys, here we go, the European glass feuds. I'm going to give you the briefest possible origin story of glass before we begin. Our sources note that humans have been working with glass since its invention in the Near East, circa 2000 BCE. Glassmakers mostly worked with molds to press it into beads, seals, and inlays. Around 1500 BCE, finer vessels started being exported from Egypt, the best among them coming from Phoenician glass manufacturers and exporters who had a great supply of silica-rich sands in their local area. Later, around the 1st century BCE, we see glass blowing developed in Palestine. Depending on the locality, glass has historically been used in 5 different ways. Beads, counters, toys, and jewelry are prime among them and were produced almost universally throughout Eurasia before 1850, especially as glass became a substitute for precious stones. Glass vessels, vases, and containers saw great development by the Italians, first the Romans and later the Venetians. As for stained glass specifically, descriptions of it date back as far as the 5th century CE, even though it did not reach its height until Europe's Gothic era. The production of stained glass also evolved over time. It was created by monastic workshops and later guilds in the Middle Ages, but by the start of the art form's decline in the 17th and 18th centuries, production was usually being done by individuals or families. Then the 19th century sees the reintroduction of workshops and large studios producing stained glass. So, honeys, you may be wondering, out of that entire long history, why I have chosen this time frame. According to our sources for today, the middle of the 19th century marks the modern history of glass, so we're going to look at the lead up to that and a little bit of the after. Now, these same articles admit that some things remain the same. The established glass-producing centers of Europe remained pretty much stuck on the styles of glassware that they became famous for. For example, Britannica writes, quote, "English glass houses continued their production of deeply cut crystal, engraved glass, and to a lesser extent colored and painted glass were given the greatest attention in Central Europe. The Venetian glass houses at Murano were the leading exponents of furnace-manipulated glass," end quote. But we are able to point to the middle of the 19th century as this moment of before and after, this moment of splitting, because we see new norms emerge from it. We see shifts like, quote, "a renewed interest in the beauty of the material itself expressed in the use of thick masses and in internal figuring and patterning," end quote, which we might note is considered among the most significant modern contributions to the art of glass. We additionally see a sort of self-consciousness start to be expressed alongside the public discussion of glassware in art journals, as well as the adoption of grand exhibitions in glass art and museums beginning to collect it. From this point in the timeline afterwards, there is a heightened awareness of glass's history and a heightened exchange of ideas regarding its possibilities. As I said at the start of our episode, the evolution of glass is basically the story of international relationships, or vice versa. And it all starts with the Venetians isolating their glassmakers at the end of the 13th century. On November 8th of 1291, a new Italian law was passed that legally confined almost all of Venice's glassmaking industry to one of the islands in the cluster of Murano, located less than 2 kilometers or 1.2 miles north of the Venetian mainland, and which are all linked to each other by short bridges. The reasoning for this was actually two-part. It was done mostly as a safety measure to prevent the wooden structures of the city from catching fire via the glass furnaces, but it also allowed the Venetians to keep the expertise and thus their secrets confined, as well as easily monitored by the government, who tracked their imports and exports. Sources tell us that, quote, "glassmakers were not allowed to leave the island without permission from the government. Leaving without permission or revealing trade secrets was punishable punishable by death, end quote. However, nobles and other societal notables could come and go so often that workers would often earn higher social status through association. The opportunity to grow one's social status as a glassmaker grew after the passing of a law in December of 1376, which stated that any children of glassmakers' daughters who married noblemen would keep their father's noble titles, was passed. This separation of the glassmakers continues to be the norm into the 15th century, with Venice staying dominant in the glass game until about the 17th century. But taking this bit by bit, the 15th century. Italy was the world leader in glass production at this point because of their continuous improvements in glass quality as well as techniques, including the invention of cristallo. Cristallo is a term first used in 14th century Venice to describe glass that was totally colorless and resembles rock crystal, though this particular type often has a gray or brownish tint. Other important inventions of this period included new colored glasses such as the girasole or sunflower colored semi-opaque glass made with lead arsenate, chalcedony glass, which allows colors to blend and switch from one to the other within the same piece, and aventurina glass, which contains small metallic sparkling particles. The 16th century is generally considered the golden age for Venetian glassmaking in Murano. Major trading partners at the time included the Spanish Indies, other Italian states, Spain, Ottoman Turkey, and the German-speaking states. Numerous leaders and dignitaries visited Murano as well, including dukes, princes, generals, cardinals, archbishops, ambassadors. Records from the time indicate at least 28 glassmaking furnaces were operating in Murano as of 1581. But as the 17th century begins, competition heats up with several things happening in Europe all at once. History sees the publication of the first printed books on glass technology, L'Arte Vitraria, published in 1612 by the Florentine priest Antonio Neri, who developed glassmaking knowledge through experiences in Pisa, Florence, and later in the Low Countries, is chief among them. Our sources note in particular, quote, "This book was a great success, was translated into numerous languages, and probably inspired some of the experiments carried out by the major inventors of new types of glass in other European countries," end quote. The Milanese glass masters had also escaped their island in the second half of the 16th century, and by this time had set up shop across Europe, joining workshops, factories, etc. to create competition in the form of luxury glass items. Their designs would very often mimic Renaissance Venetian wares so closely they started being called façon de Venise, which is now the official term for such glassworks which use the same techniques, decorations, and production methods, etc. as they would have in Venice. Sometimes they would make the façon de Venise so similar that even some chemical analyses can't tell the difference between Venetian glass and that produced by other nations. Throughout the 17th century, we see market as well as production powers shifting as inventions of more efficient production methods by several European countries lead to new high-quality and cheaper crystal glasses. Meanwhile, the Venetian scene did not see anywhere near the scale of technological innovation or industrial production occurring elsewhere. The Corning Museum of Glass writes, quote, "As industrialization increased, so did economic stability. The European middle class began to expand. Glassmakers responded to the growing demand for elegant consumer goods with high-quality products that were simple and restrained. The skill of the decorators, the glass cutters, engravers, and painters became as important as that of the glass blowers," end quote, because the industry was transformed time and again across the century by the changing consumer tastes. You may be wondering exactly why innovation and industrialization matters so very much to this story. The Corning points out that the British, the French, and the English were all able to boost their production by using steam to power the cutting wheels, which made the production of cut glass more efficient and reduced costs for them. Which is as nice a segue as any to start talking about what happened in said countries. France was among many competitors who benefited from the arrival of Milanese glassworkers who copied the formats, decorations, etc. they had been using, but quickly found their niche in the French market. An example of this would be a wine glass under the Corning Museum's definition for façon de Venise, which is quite dramatic in shape as it looks more like your typical cylinder than a wine glass of today. The bottom is very flat and only the top rim is slightly wider than the bottom. The bottom rim features what looks like scroll rolling glasswork along it. The stem is no less dramatic, adorned with a flower at the highest and narrowest point possible. It also has around the two sides two semicircles with pointed outer ridges that resemble maybe seahorses or dragons. The ridged semicircular pieces are made of blue glass. The piece shows a great level of technical skill and forethought while featuring crystal clear glass, and we see France strategizing as well here. In the middle of the 17th century, the minister Colbert set up the Manufacture Royale des Glaces des Miroirs to produce mirrors of larger sizes and in higher amounts than Venice through a newly developed technique of cast placing. This means pouring molten glass paste onto a large surface, then rolling it. France quickly cornered this particular market. Then we have the Low Countries. If you're unfamiliar, that means Germany, Holland, Bohemia, Austria, a couple different now nations in that area. So remember, there's even competition and complexity within the region. The Low Countries had two main but crucial advantages: that of materials to make glass, as well as that there was quick and large development of communities of glass engravers and glass painters. The geography and natural substances of Bohemia, for example, have been called perfectly suited to glassmaking because silica, which is a component of glass, and lumber as a fuel for production are rich in the area. They additionally have chalk and potash, which make products more stable than other European glass, particularly their main competitors, the Italians. Say our sources, quote, Bohemia's unique glass allowed for more elaborate structural forms and more intricate surface decoration, end quote. Throughout the 16 and 1700s, expert communities of glass engravers developed in Holland and Brandenburg. So Germany cornered the market of personalizing glasses with added inscriptions, landscape views, mythological scenes, even use instructions. For example, engraved grapes indicating that a container was for champagne or sparkling wine, while another might have grains indicating that it's a receptacle for ale. The German glass personalizers also occasionally did religious narratives. The Low Countries also had an important dimension to its glass arts, which does not seem to have been the case anywhere else. Martine van Elk highlights in Renaissance Quarterly that we do know several Dutch women glass engraving authors. Anna Romers-Vischer, Maria Tesselschade Romers-Vischer, and Anna Maria von Scherman were among those who made their names at this time. Van Elk goes on to describe their current obscurity and compare it to that of other historically feminine art forms in order to point out that, quote, like embroidery, emblems, and alba and macorum, engraved glasses combined text and image, transforming each glass into an object which filled key social and cultural functions. Above all, engraving glasses allowed women to forge new self-representations, specifically through their use of play to question binary oppositions and moral certainties, end quote. We'll take a peek at two different façons de Venices from the Low Countries in order to get a sense of their style. First, one simply called Façon de Venise beaker from 1580 or 1600 out of Antwerp, held by the Art Institute of Chicago. This one is much different than our French counterpart, Honey's. While also cylindrical in shape, this time the bowl takes up the majority of the glass with the stem as tiny as possible. The bottom appears to be encased maybe in gold, at least the rim at the bottom of the glass. On all four sides, as if it were a compass pointing north, south, east, west, there are little added on molded lion heads, which have a bit of the gold leaf remaining atop those as well. And the texture of the entire glass is crinkled too, like someone curled up a bunch of paper and then used that as the basis for this glass. It is ever so slightly brownish in tone as well. Our second Low Country example looks much more similar to the first. We see again here very seahorse-looking curled elements scrolling along the almost bulbous stem. We have a relatively wide actual bowl at the top of the stem there with some detailing work along the bottom of it. This glass is very, very clear with a hint of green. According to our sources, this general sort of wine glass or goblet with its flat central stem section and so elaborately done was developed in 1500s Venice. Furthermore, that seahorse or serpent shape of the wings on either side of the stem is a characteristic type known as a verre à serpents or glass with serpents. Though this this sort of glass could be functional, it was more likely to be displayed decoratively. At first, the Venetians decide that their response will be to fight back, but that is not too successful at all. Trade and economies begin to be affected by these new industries, and the Venetians are basically left to adapt or be left behind. Fascinatingly, though, during this period, we even see some early back and forth within the nations themselves. As we head to the middle and end of the 18th century, the Venetians largely continue making small mirrors out of blown cylinders of molten glass, which masters would stretch manually into rectangular shapes, while the French fully embraced their cast plate method. Among their failed efforts were ones to renovate their traditional cristallos using new fluxes to reduce production costs while maintaining the high quality of luxury glass. One such recipe was by Giuseppe Briati, who invented a potash crystal glass to counteract the Bohemian competition. Several other Venetian recipes would recommend significant additions of lead to the traditional soda lime silica glass, or even the use of a new decoloration process using arsenic or antimony and potassium nitrates, which was more efficient than traditional manganese methods. Now, you may be wondering, where exactly is the UK in all of this? We haven't talked about them in a while. Well, England grows and develops its own market after 1700, but is especially affected by new trade policies with Ireland and the American Revolution throughout the rest of the 18th century. But starting with the beginning, because it was technically a part of the British Empire, Ireland was subject to British trade policies and therefore banned from competing with the British glass industry within the empire's borders, so to speak, from 1745 until 1780, when pressure from Irish entrepreneurs on British Parliament to lift all restrictions paid off. The years after became known as the period of freedom. Popularity quickly shifted to Irish glass, which was partially the British government's own fault. They had increased taxes on glass houses in 1777 in part because of the American Revolution's costs, which drove production costs of British glass and thus purchase prices sky high. Facing this problem, many manufacturers simply relocated to the tax-exempt Republic of Ireland. So the period of freedom could also be called the period of relocation, and during it, Irish glass houses in Dublin, Belfast, Cork, and Waterford produced incomparable glassware of all kinds based on contemporary English designs and exported giant amounts of it. Quote, everything from tiny salt cellars and wine glasses to large-scale candelabras and chandeliers, end quote. Our sources went on to note that during this time, Irish glassmakers perfected the technique of cutting deep facets into the bodies of their vessels as well, increasing demand even further. With the lift of that internal ban in 1780, America, and soon to be the United States, saw significant Irish glass imports alongside those from Central Europe and goods made in England, but quickly became infatuated with the dazzling look of Irish glass. Its, quote, reputation for finely cut and faceted chandeliers and tableware, end quote, which aimed to communicate the newly free and just as fashionable aims of American interiors. However, this period was not to last. Ireland eventually became subject to the same tax structures after the Act of the Union with Great Britain became law in both countries in 1800. One more fascinating thing about British glassware from the 1700s, it sometimes expresses even internal political allegiances. Some known pieces encapsulate the continuing religious tensions which resulted from the deposition of Catholic King James II in 1688 by his Protestant son-in-law William, as well as daughters Mary and Anne. Glasses engraved with imagery of buds and roses indicated Jacobic sympathies as well as Catholic ones, and were, quote, often used by covert political clubs working to encourage a Stuart invasion of England, an attempt that failed in 1745 at the bloody Battle of Culloden in Scotland, end quote. The Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art notes that England was relatively late to the glassmaking game compared to the rest of Europe, but in the 1700s made two key chemical discoveries. The first was the invention of a new type of dark glass which was used in prototypes of dark glass bottles used today, which were stronger and cheaper than those available at the time. Not only did these bottles require raw materials and technology rarely available in Venice, they could also be made in large quantities. Second, England also discovered that adding lead to the glass-making mixture created a brilliant colorless body which resembled raw crystal. So, quote, virtually Nearly overnight, England went from being an isolated island to the epicenter of fashionable glass, replacing Venice and its imitators. By switching their fuel source from wood to coal, English glass houses ramped up production to meet increased demand, even as they helped to begin the dependence on fossil fuels, which has led to today's climate change, end quote. Chilled magazine points out that the leaded crystal has a particularly high refractive index, allowing it to create prismatic rainbows, and because it has a longer working time, or time that it stays hot, it can be more intricately shaped, designed, decorated, and given ornate stems. Glass made with this new formula was extremely affordable, yet looked just like expensive Venetian glass to the untrained eye, so it became a favorite of status-seeking middle and business classes across Europe. And as if all that weren't already enough, remember at the end of the 1700s, Napoleon starts invading. He conquers the city of Venice and ends the Venetian Republic during May of 1797. Afterwards, Venetian glassmaking became unprofitable because of tariffs and taxes put on them under the control of France and Austria, as well as forced limitations on their productions of certain glass goods. For example, Napoleon closed Venetian glass factories in 1807 to any activities outside of simple glassware and bead making. So, all said and done, across the 17th century and well into the 18th century, the Venetians and just about everybody else moved towards a specialization strategy, becoming exceptionally good at just one part of glassmaking and leaving the rest to everybody else. The Venetians maintained their own monopoly on traditional products. They blew glass to make small-sized mirrors, invested heavily into making glass beads, a product which didn't require technological innovation but had high profit margins, and in general began to recover. Compared to the so-called golden age of Venetian glass, they produced these beads in much greater amounts in the 18th century. After all, it wasn't until the mid-1800s that the influence even of the French cast plate method of mirror making was felt in Murano. The recovery of Italian glassmaking as a national industry is really important, as it shows exactly how much change occurred from the middle of the 17th century to the middle of the 19th. In about 200 years, the drop in production of luxury glass was counterbalanced by an increase in the production of window panes, mirrors, and beads. The first two of those three continued to be produced in large amounts because though they were low in value, they were high in demand, primarily for the Italian markets, but also for the Levant, Europe, and North Africa. Beads remained a Venetian specialty. At the beginning of the 1800s, clear, sparkling British lead glass enjoyed its own heyday, especially as craftsmen employed techniques for producing fine glass learned from Venetian artisans who had dominated European high-end glassmaking prior. But British and Irish glass, too, eventually settled into their niches, in part because an excise duty on glass had been removed in 1845. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was considered the apex of a period of intense activity by British glasshouses to rival the Bohemians and the French in colored, layered, and enamel-painted wares, on top of excelling in their traditional, deeply cut crystal. Some of the surviving examples from the most enterprising of the English glassmakers of the period, the Richardson firm, include some painted and engraved pieces as well as crystal wares, as you might expect, deeply cut. Yet English glassmaking, even though it was into the Victorian era at this point, maintained a close relationship with Venetian glassmaking. The latter was influenced by the former in addition to the fashions of the Far East and historical style borrowings. For example, says the Corning, Renaissance, Rococo, and Symbolist details would often show up in wares produced in Great Britain as well as the US and elsewhere during the 1880s through 90s. The museum points out that around 1880, Thomas Webb and Sons in England introduced the rock crystal style, which featured deep cutting, copper wheel engraving, and polishing. Glass in this style was made to imitate luxury vessels made out of quartz, which came from other places in Europe and the Orient. Which brings us back to the Low Country, Central Europe. As we advance through the 1800s, we advance into the age of Romanticism, which brought with it a desire for color. So the glass houses of Central Europe, especially in present-day Czech Republic, fed the appetite for such glass across several decades, mostly by adding dissolved minerals to their molten glass batches to create boldly colored wares, and smartly using the world's fairs during this time to popularize them. According According to Bonham's auction house, the newly most popular glass was largely coming from the center of the industry in Bohemia, more specifically Meistersdorf, a town in the north only 60 kilometers from Dresden, where they worked in a style known as Biedermeier. Biedermeier, they write, is, quote, a product of the peaceful interlude in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, linked to the rise of the bourgeois middle classes, with stark, strong shapes that show off the finest technical craftsmanship, end quote. The Corning Museum points out that nature, symbolism, and Oriental art also inspired Central European glassmakers. They would revive shapes, decorative motifs, and techniques of the past in their glass factories during this time. Now, as I said, chemicals were key. They would dissolve gold chloride for their prized ruby and cranberry-colored vessels, and frequently cut away colored overlays of glass to reveal contrasting details underneath. This would mimic the appearance of ancient Greek and Roman cameo jewelry. Our sources specifically point out glassmaker Friedrich Egermann, who mostly worked in clear glass but led the endless Bohemian experimentation with color, noticing that simply engraving colored glass was not too exciting. He was able to add a bit of romance to his works, which helped with sales by creating, in 1818, a yellow or amber-colored stain made from silver chloride and following it up with a new ruby-colored stain made using copper instead of gold, perfected around 1832. Even at this point, though, the friendly competition was not over. Artists in the Low Countries were still rushing to beat the inevitable clock on how long they could keep their secrets secret. In 1835, a delegation from France visited Bohemia and returned with samples for the French factories to learn from. Imperial Glassworks in St. Petersburg followed suit shortly after, and revolution in the Austrian Empire in 1848 led many craftsmen to seek work in Britain and the United States. So colored glass was very much a fad, and glass engravers from Meistersdorf and Steinschenau were lucky to win medals at the Exposition Universelle exhibit in Paris in 1855. Arriving at the 1850s, just about the middle of the 19th century, we see that the Central European glass houses are still producing a variety of colored as well as layered glasswares, mostly those associated with the Biedermeier period just past, meaning they continued to work with deeply cut glasses in the English style and didn't really change much about their work until around 1880. At that point, we start to see some Bohemian glassworks operating out of Haida, for example, Fritz Heckert in Petersdorf, starting to produce glasses in more historicizing styles. What was called Jugendstil in Central Europe, but is known elsewhere as the Art Nouveau style, made a deep impression in turn-of-the-century Central European glasswares around the 1880s and afterwards. You can see that influence in the slender shapes and flowing organic motifs that come around, especially after an 1897 Tiffany glass exhibition, which toured several museums in the region. We see a little influence from the concurrent British arts and crafts movement, especially the ideas of English art critic John Ruskin, as advocated for in his book The Stones of Venice, in the push for greater use of so-called plastic forms as well as furnace decoration. These had the impacts of influencing Central European designers to align form and decoration with purpose and material, so the designs became simpler and cleaner in some cases. And finally, from the so-called Oriental style, or chinoiserie, we see gilding, asymmetrical forms, unusual perspectives, and flora and fauna which are East Asian in appearance. Though popular at the beginning of the 1800s, it sorta died out throughout that century as shifting tastes become influenced by other far-off markets and places, such as Turkey, Egypt, and Greece. The Corning Museum argues that this shifting influence from far to near East and the resulting, quote, large and flourishing export market, end quote, is one of the most intriguing developments in Bohemian glass production during the 1800s. Bohemia became an especially important center of production for Islamic art, with such wares ending up in mosques from Cairo to Tehran. Quote, vast numbers of enameled glass hookah pipes, decanters, rosewater ewers, and mosque lamps enameled and engraved with portraits of important figures from the Persian Qajar dynasty or dignitaries from the Ottoman Empire made their way to Persia and Iran, end quote. All of these various influences, all of this experimentation makes all the more sense when we consider that Bohemian glass demand died down with the end of the Baroque era and the shift to the more restrained, less detailed neoclassical era from about 1750 1850 onwards. However, this proved to be just a little bit of a dip, as by the middle of the 19th century, the 1850s onwards, Bohemian glassmakers were enjoying what our sources describe as a renaissance. Quote, with an ever more connected world, producers looked to new processes and technologies that allowed for production on a greater scale, thereby satisfying growing demand among middle-class consumers, end quote. All in all, a fascinating, complex, and innovative century for the Central European glasshouses. So to recap, honeys, by the end of the 1800s, we have the following landscape. Venetian glass production as a whole in the last 3 decades of that century doubled that of the end of the 16th century, which was considered a high point for the Murano industry. So we don't have to worry about them too much. In the 1860s, Museo Vitrario was founded at Murano, and an artist by the name of Antonio Salviati got to work producing glasses which went on to attract a ton of attention at the Paris exhibition of 1876. His works were variations of traditional Venetian styles with elaborate furnace decoration. The production of this type of glass continued at Murano even beyond the remainder of the 19th century. And one more thing about what was now the official Italian glass scene. Pressed glassware had come onto the market with great promise in the first half of the 1800s and proved itself worthy of production as a cheap imitation of cut crystal. As the years passed, innovations in decoration methods continued for pressed glassware, and in the 20th century, a series of new simple forms appeared. According to the Corning Museum of Glass, since the late 17th century throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, English glasshouses made their glass more brilliant by adding lead oxide, while Bohemians achieved similar effects by adding chalk. French production, however, remained primarily split between cut crystal and colored wares, which eventually gave way to the increasing popularity of what were called opalines, or glass works that were semi-opaque but white or slightly colored, often featuring elaborately painted and gilded decorations. During the second half of the 19th century, the French inventive genius mainly shows up in the work of individual artists who encouraged a new modern spirit to glass. As a sort of case study, we'll take a look at 3 individual artists who experimented in glasswork throughout the late 1860s and 70s and who were represented in the International Exhibition of 1878 occurring in Paris. Joseph Brocard first, who studied the enameling of glass and whose main ambition was to reproduce medieval Syrian glass. Eugene Rousseau, a commissioning dealer in ceramics who had turned to glasswork at the end of the 1860s and who was at the height of his achievement at this point. And the best known among them, Émile Gaillet of Nancy, who'd been experimenting in glasswork since about 1867 and whose work largely contributed to the Art Nouveau of the end of the century. He also reflected the prevailing interest in Japanese art. Another example would be Henri Cros, who pioneered the pâte de verre, or powdered glass fired in a mold technique, during the end of the 19th century. This was used successfully by several French artists later on, including Albert Demus and François de Courchemont. And with all that going on, we also see French paperweights become internationally known and admired of all things, while their larger factories, particularly Baccarat and St. Louis, continued to participate in the international fashions of production for the rest of the century and beyond. So as you can see, honeys, there were several political, social, and economic factors at play in the glass exchanges going on between the 15th and the 19th centuries, with the most important and interesting activity happening between the 17th and 19th centuries. Throughout these hundreds of years of secret keeping and stealing, of factory building and discovering new methodologies, the one thing that remains constant and a source of hope for us all is this continuous inventive spirit, the drive to do more, to make more, and to learn. I know we typically do a through lines and legacies section at the end of the episode, and that's what you're expecting to happen here, but honeys, I actually have a part 2 planned, so you can expect more news on what happens next in terms of the evolution of glass in an upcoming episode. We're going to leave it here for the day. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you have learned a thing or two. As always, hydrate or dihydrate, take care of yourselves, and we will talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.